Hi, my name is Brendan Malone and you're listening to The Dispatches, the podcast that strives to cut through all the noise in order to challenge the popular narratives of the day with some good old-fashioned contrarian thinking. You might not always agree, but at least you'll be taking a deeper look at the world around you. Hi everybody, welcome along to the Thursday edition of the patrons-only episode of the Dispatches podcast. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again. And today's topic of conversation, 5 things which have destroyed the Star Wars mythology. Yes, the one and only, once great Star Wars mythology. The very first film, which was released in 1977, almost 50 years ago now. That mythological world is now in such a state of decline that it has all but collapsed. For those who don't know the backstory, George Lucas, who created the original Star Wars and came up with the concept and wrote the original film, and this film that went on to become this massive blockbuster, it completely revolutionized the way films are made and the way that storytelling was done in the world of cinema. It also invented new technologies that are now just taken for granted in cinema, and it also revolutionized product marketing related to, like, the marketing of toys related to cinema. We sort of take those things for granted now, but Star Wars was the mythology which kicked all of that off. It was a mythology which most people today probably have some connection with in their childhood. They probably have memories of watching the films or those big milestone moments or being immersed in that world, in a world of fantasy and science fiction and their imaginative play and all that kind of stuff that great mythologies do. Star Wars had that in bucket loads. Now, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, some years ago decided to sell his Star Wars mythology to the Disney Corporation. And almost immediately, as soon as Disney took over, the decline began. And the warning signs were right there about the trajectory that we were heading on when Disney released the very first brand new Star Wars film under their tenure, called The Force Awakens. And The Force Awakens was basically little more than a plagiarizing of the original 1977 film. They didn't bring anything new to the fore. What they did was they went back and they copied the plot from the original film, and they just updated it a bit, added a couple of extra new characters. There was a brand new main character called Rey, and Rey was what they call in the world of writing a Mary Sue. And what that means is that she arrived fully developed into the story. There was no tension, there was no drama around this character because they could just do everything. Whether it's piloting a spaceship, fixing a spaceship, wielding a lightsaber, which if you know your Star Wars mythology, you will know that that's a skill that you have to work at, and with virtue and with practice and hard work you get better at. But no, she was fully capable without any training whatsoever. There was no drama, there's no tension around her character, which means she's not particularly interesting, but the reason why they created this character this way was because there was a very strong political, ideological motivation around feminist ideology to create this sort of a character and just sort of ham-fistedly shoehorn them into the world of Star Wars. So the warning signs were right there, and it sort of just progressively got worse until the final film in that new trilogy just derailed completely. And it's not just to do with ideology and plagiarizing of stories, but the storytelling just got more and more messed up and dysfunctional due to the lack of good writing that was going on in Star Wars. And then came a host of TV series, and the latest television series, Star Wars TV series, released by Disney is called The Acolyte. And if you haven't heard about this, holy moly, The Acolyte has, I think, effectively just thrown a whopping great hand grenade into the middle of the Star Wars mythology and just blown everything to bits. The Force in the Acolyte TV series is now being referred to as a thread, and in ways that aren't really consistent with this mythology, and also in ways that are contradictory because the writing's just not that great. We have lesbian space witches who used the Force to make twin girls, an immaculate conception of sorts. We have pronouns in Star Wars now, as of the latest episode in The Acolyte, and on top of all of that, a whole lot of just really basic bad writing errors, things that just don't really make coherent sense and things that are contradictory. It is an absolute mess. Now, Star Wars had issues prior to this point, prior to the sale by George Lucas, the prequels were not a great example of cinematic storytelling. They were fun and they were enjoyable, but there were some issues with the storytelling, and it seems, I think the general consensus is most people would say that what happened with the prequel trilogy, so George Lucas released his original 3 films, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and then Return of the Jedi, and then he went back and he released, starting in the 90s, the prequel trilogy of films, The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith. And basically the general consensus seems to be that by that time, several decades later, George Lucas had effectively become all-powerful. And on the original films, he was required to collaborate with other people, other skilled filmmakers, and the end result was quite a good and enjoyable and tightly constructed piece of cinema. But by the time he gets to the 90s and he's making his prequel trilogy, he now has complete and total control. And there isn't as much collaboration. And it turns out that George Lucas actually relies on collaboration to make really good films. And so they weren't quite as good. But the problems that Star Wars had prior to the Disney Corporation taking over was nothing like the problems they've got now. The Acolyte TV series, just to give you a sense of what's going on here and how bad this is, on Rotten Tomatoes, the Acolyte TV series has an audience approval rating of just 14% out of 100. That is unbelievable, and it is totally unheard of for a Star Wars series or part of the Star Wars mythology. On IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, the Acolyte TV series has an audience rating of just 3.4 out of a possible 10. And just in case you're wondering, the other TV series that Disney has produced, and one or two of those, like the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV series and the Book of Boba Fett TV series, they had some writing and production issues that weren't great and meant that those series were not as strong as they could have been. They still rate, according to the audience, just above 7 out of 10. So this is how bad things are right now in the Star Wars mythology. So in today's episode, I just want to give 5 reasons why this has happened, because there's a perfect storm of things, I think, that have come together to create this problem. The first one is the fact that postmodernism has a rejection of objective truth. Postmodernist ideology, that reaction to Enlightenment liberalism that drove the West towards relativism and subjectivism. So relativism as in there is no truth. Your truth is true for you. My truth is true for me. His truth is true for him and her truth is true for her. And subjectivism, the individual subject, you or I, will make up truth for ourselves. That is a very predominant aspect of the postmodernist ideology and its rejection of tradition and its rejection also of Enlightenment liberalism. And postmodernism is very much the dominant school of thought in which people who are in the artistic and writing space, who are trained in those spaces, they are exposed to now on a regular basis. It's like the dominant ideological formation school that they would go through in most cases. And this is now being reflected in a lot of film and television and other things that are being written, and it's definitely made its way into Star Wars. And postmodernism has a rejection of objective truth. Now, the problem is that Star Wars was very much a mythology that was built on the concepts that are absolutely grounded in objective truth. Like the mere fact that Star Wars was about good versus evil was just too much for the postmodernist mind. And this whole mythology of objective truths was just anathema, so it had to be torn down. So that's the first problem. Second problem is, again, related to postmodernism. Postmodernism is built on this idea of a rejection of meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are big stories that explain everything. And so postmodernism rejects religion because it says, no, that's a meta-narrative. It's got no time for Christianity or any other religious meta-narrative. It rejects liberalism, because liberalism is also a meta-narrative. It's a big story that explains the world and the human person. Meta-narratives are also things like language. So postmodernism rejects language and considers language to be unreliable. Postmodernism also rejects science because science is also a meta-narrative. And so this rejection of meta-narrative is very much one of the fundamental tenets of the postmodernist ideology. And guess what Star Wars presents? Star Wars presents to you in a cinematic form a meta-narrative. The archetypes of Joseph Campbell, these Jungian archetypes, are very much fundamental to the original Star Wars mythology, and what they are is they are a basic human anthropology. They present particular traits about the human person and the human experience that are objectively true and that are consistent and we can see happening in the world around us. And these things were very influential on the original Star Wars and the writing of the original Star Wars because George Lucas was very immersed in Joseph Campbell's thinking and philosophy around mythology and that sort of Jungian archetype type approach to writing storytelling, like the hero's journey, for example, is one example of this. And so what you've got with Star Wars is you've got a meta-narrative. The archetypes of Star Wars are basically a form of anthropology, and it's real. Even though Star Wars is a mythology and it's a made-up story, the archetypes, what it's using, those things are real, and of course, for a postmodernist, they are a meta-narrative. And there's things like that whole sense of calling and vocation in Star Wars, even the mysticism of Star Wars, and there's like basically a sacramental worldview that is present through things like the concept of the Force that you have in the Star Wars, this idea that there are invisible realities and there are outward signs of those invisible realities. The world is not just materialistic. Like say, for example, Star Trek as a comparison. Star Trek is a more materialistic sort of view of the future. Star Wars is very much a more sacramental view. There is a mystical element. There is a supernatural and a natural element together. Now, this, of course, I just need to be clear again, this is a mythology. It's not a theology. So you wouldn't look to Star Wars as a theology, a Christian theology, or any other sort of theology for that matter. It is a mythology, but good mythology will actually be grounded in the reality of the human experience. That's what makes it so engaging and so enjoyable for us to immerse ourselves in. And Star Wars is very much a mythology that did that. And so therefore Star Wars is a mythology that absolutely has meta-narrative running all through it. And so postmodernists just disdain that kind of thing. And so they don't want a bar of it. Now, I have to say here, and this is important to point out, unfortunately, George Lucas actually opened the door for this himself, and he allowed postmodernism to corrupt his own mythology long before Disney arrived. They really amplified the corruption of the mythology, but he opened the door to this. So in the third and final trilogy film, the original trilogy, that third film, Return of the Jedi, we have the Force ghost, as they are known within Star Wars, of the dead character Obi-Wan Kenobi. He died in the original Star Wars film. And he is sitting on a log talking to Luke Skywalker, and Luke is challenging him because he says, hey, you never told me that Darth Vader was my dad. And in response to that, the character of Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke, look, what I told you was true from a certain point of view. You're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. Now, that there is a classic relativistic way of looking at the world, very comfortable for the postmodernist ideology to view the world through that sort of a lens. But the problem is it's also starting to undo the mythological strength of the original Star Wars. Now, why did George Lucas do this? Well, I don't think George Lucas did this because of any particular ideological commitment. He did it because he was trying to write himself out of a writing black hole, a plot corner that he had written himself into. So you remember in the original Star Wars film, Darth Vader is not, there's no indication that Darth Vader is Luke's father, and instead Obi-Wan Kenobi has that very brief conversation with Luke about how he knew his father and he was a pilot and all that sort of stuff. And then by the second film, we discover that in actual fact, Obi-Wan Kenobi hadn't fully revealed the truth to Luke because Darth Vader was actually Luke's father. And so now you've got this little sort of potential plot conflict. It's like, well, did what Obi-Wan Kenobi told Luke in the first film, was that actually accurate then? Was he lying? Does that really make sense? And I think George Lucas overthought this, and so by the third film, this was his way of sort of trying to solve the problem, effectively, trying to write himself out of that corner, but he did it in the worst way possible. I think all he had to do was have Obi-Wan Kenobi say, look, I felt that it was too early for you to know the truth about your father. So I told you some of his story, but not the whole story, because I wanted to protect you and you weren't ready yet and all that kind of stuff. That's how he could have done it, but he didn't. He did it this way by saying, look, what I told you was true from a certain point of view. And unfortunately, that actually opened the door for what Disney has done on steroids. The third problem, the third reason why the mythology has been destroyed is because Star Wars has now absolutely become a propaganda tool. Now, you might remember, and you've heard me probably talk about this on the podcast a few times, that Karl Marx talked about religion and he called it the opiate of the masses. And what he meant by that was religion, in particular he's thinking of Christianity, is like a cultural drug. And what it does is it stupefies people. It keeps them dumbed down. It's like being in a mental institution and sort of drooling out both sides of your mouth because they've given you all sorts of sedatives. And basically that's how he saw religion. It was like this cultural sedative that sedated people and stopped them from rising up and throwing off the shackles of their oppressors. So he called religion the opiate of the masses. He thought it was bad. He thought it was immoral, and it kept us from our rightful freedom and, our rightful revolutionary stance. And so after Marx, though, come the neo-Marxists. They are the sort of foundational beginnings of what we would call today cultural Marxism, because Marx was only interested in a class struggle and his focus was on economic injustice and economic disparities. That's where his focus was. But the neo-Marxists, they start expanding the view of Marxism and they start looking for more and more categories of oppressed and oppressor classes. So different people who are doing the oppressing and different people who are being oppressed, and they broaden the scope of it. So they move beyond just economics and class and they start looking more broadly. And as I said, this is really the beginning, the very infancy of the cultural Marxist movement. Now, for the cultural Marxists and for the neo-Marxists, they considered media to be the new opiate of the new masses. So they looked at media and they saw media as like a stupefying agent, and they were very, very fixated on media and trying to get control of media. Now, in their days, what that really meant was basically broadcast radio, but it also then quickly moved into television and film and newsreels and things like that. Now, this was the beginning of mass media, something that hadn't been on the scene, the global scene previously, but they recognized straight away that this was actually a very important and powerful tool that could be utilized to shape the minds of the masses. And so they saw it as a powerful and important tool that they had to get a hold of for propagandistic purposes. And that's exactly what has happened with Star Wars. It's just a continuation of that. This once great mythology, this universal mythology that is just absolutely beloved and elevated in the world of cinema all around the globe. I mean, this was just too good a prize to resist. They had to get their hands on it, and they desperately wanted to inject their politics into it. And so that's what they've done. And it's more now about political preaching than it is about mythology. It's not about being faithful to the lore of Star Wars. It's not about being faithful to the traditions of Star Wars. No, it's about tearing those things down because A, I'm a postmodernist and I tear down in revolutionary fervour the things that I think are evil and which are holding us back. And then I erect my own new vision of the world. And B, what I do is everything's political and I use these things as political tools to preach a message. It's about trying to preach my gospel to you. That's what they're doing. And so Star Wars has become a propaganda tool, and that's why you see this awful corruption of the mythology now, because the people behind this who are driving this, not at the corporate level, but at the storytelling level, they're more interested in the politics that they are injecting into the world of Star Wars than they are in good storytelling, which brings me to point number 4. So the fourth problem that Star Wars now has is politicization, and political hiring is leading to inferior art and mythology. So we've already talked about how the politicization of mythology itself and the storytelling is creating all sorts of problems that completely gut Star Wars of its once former greatness. But what you've also got with politicization is that politicization at the cultural and societal level in general. And what I mean by this is when Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses, what he was meaning, as I said, was that religion was effectively a political drug that dumbed you down. And what that means is, if the most sacred relationship, the most important of all relationships that a human being could ever be in, the relationship between them and God and them and their religious leaders, if that is political, then everything else, which is far less important and is not sacred, that must also be political. So everything becomes political at that point. And we are all, as one commentator has said, the children of Karl Marx in one way or another because of this, because everything is now political. Now, formerly, that wasn't the way we viewed the world. The Christian view of the world is one that is relational. So first of all, you're called to be in relationship with God. As Jesus tells us, the first and most important of the commandments is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And of course, in the Christian tradition, God is not just a solitary being. God is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So God is actually a divine community, a perfect, divine, eternal relationship. That's who God is. And so we're called to be in relationship with the first and most important of all relationships, the first and most important of all communities, the Trinity. And so that's the first point, the first and most important point of the relational nature of Christianity, be in relationship with God. The second most important command, Jesus tells us, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so you are called to be in relationship with your neighbor as well, the people around you. So be in relationship with God and be in relationship with neighbor. And the third plank to this relational vision of reality that Christianity brings to the world is that we are called to be good stewards of creation. And stewardship over creation and over the natural order is a type of relationship. So we're called to be in a relationship with the natural world as well. Now, obviously, it's different from the relationship we would have and we are called into with God and the relationship that we're called into with neighbor, but it is a relationship, a way of relating nonetheless. And so that's the Christian vision of reality. It is relational. And politics in this relational view of the world is just another form of relating. And that's what politics is in the Christian vision of reality. It's important and it matters, but it is another form of relationship between persons. And it really should come out of this sense of community and the common good. But what we've got today is that's all been flipped completely on its head because Karl Marx basically said everything is political. And so instead of everything being relational, which was the Christian vision of reality, everything is now political. And politics is about power, and it's about political categories and who's got power and who doesn't. That's what politics and the political view of the world does. And so when it comes to things like hiring practices, politics and the politicization of the world doesn't care about hiring the best storytellers and artists. Instead, its primary focus is on the distribution of power. And what it tends to do is it corrupts the authentic definition of what is good. And the reason why this becomes such a fixation is because your whole worldview is about power, who's got it and who hasn't. And so instead of focusing on the relational aspect of the world and seeing us as human beings made in the image of God and called into a common sisterhood and brotherhood of genuine respect for the human dignity of each other, instead, it's all about political categories now. So in the politicized world, you're not simply a person. You're not actually a sacred image bearer in a lot of cases at all. Instead, you are a particular type of person first. You are a political category, then you are a person. So you are an LGBTQIA plus person, or you're a straight person, or you're a white person, or you are an Afro-Latino person, etc., etc., etc. So the political category comes first because the political category is more important. We are encouraged to see each other as differentiated by political categories instead of having this commonality, and we no longer fixate on the commonalities, and on top of that, we are fixated on the power differentials between different categories of people. Who's got the power? Oh, the straight, white, heterosexual males, they've got all the power. Who hasn't got all the power? It's the disabled, black, trans lesbians, etc., etc., etc. You know, the victim Olympics that people often talk about. And what happens is now, with the politicization and the political view of the world, this is now corrupting the way in which business is being done when it comes to things like hiring people. And as I said, this worldview, this ideology, doesn't care about hiring the best storytellers and artists if you're in the world of cinematic mythology. Instead, its primary focus is on the distribution of power, and what it's interested in is hiring and mixing and matching the right political categories, the right amounts of the right political categories, just to show to the world how diverse and equitable your company is. So once upon a time, we are a good film studio. That statement used to mean something like, we produce good quality cinematic tales that are loved by many people. Or we have a team of really excellent writers and directors and cinematic craftsmen who help produce the films and the stories that we tell. That's basically what it would have once meant. But now, in the modern politicized view of the world, we are a good film studio now actually means we have a diversity of political groupings who work for us, and our content is full of and promotes a diversity of political categories. And also, you'd have to probably add in there, our content promotes the right political ideologies and views of the world. And so when you are hiring people, no longer is the emphasis on let's get the best storyteller. Like it once was in the studio system, they would fight each other to try and get the best stories to turn into movies. They would fight each other to try and get the best directors and get the best actors and that kind of thing. It's not about that so much anymore. And that's having a disastrous impact upon the fundamentals of storytelling and artistic creation. Here's how a friend of mine who has a bit of an interest in political commentary and film commentary as well. Here's how he put it when talking about the Acolyte TV series. I think the real problem was always putting inexperienced showrunners and even directors at the helm of this show. They don't really understand how to pace episodic television, and this is what ultimately kills the Acolyte. We're 4 episodes into the series now, and they can't even get the pace right. Last night, on the latest episode, there were 3 instances where you swore that you had missed something in the first 3 episodes because the characters' motivations have completely changed, and this is explained away by a very quick passing reference. And so what he's trying to say there is that they don't really know what they're doing. They're not really that good at their job, and that is very evident in what you see coming out of the Disney Star Wars world. But that's not the only problem. There is a 5th and final issue here, and that is the problem of consumerism. And all I can think of when I think of Star Wars and the consumeristic destruction of modern Star Wars is that quote from The Lord of the Rings where, is it Frodo? No, I think it's Bilbo, isn't it, who says he feels like butter that's been spread just far too thin over the bread. And that's really what Star Wars has become thanks to consumerism. Now, Star Wars always had a strong marketing aspect to it. And in fact, George Lucas really is the guy who creates, out of whole cloth really, the concept of marketing, product marketing around a film. Now, there had been isolated and smaller examples of this prior to Star Wars, but Star Wars and the manufacture of toys and lunchboxes and T-shirts and everything else, that was a very shrewd economic marketing ploy on the part of George Lucas. He saw something, he understood something about the world and the potential that was there with marketing of products. And so Star Wars always had a strong marketing aspect to it. But what has happened now, it's quickly transitioned from a mythology to a product after Disney acquired it. And that's a little bit different. So it's one thing to have a mythology that has a strong marketing aspect that's attached to the mythology, but it's a whole nother thing altogether for that mythology to be turned into a product. And that's exactly what happened when it was sold to Disney. So under Lucas, the products that he sold were the fruit of the story. So the toys and the lunchboxes and the T-shirts and the pencil cases and the pillowcases and all that other stuff that was sold with Star Wars all over it, that was branded, that was a product of the story. You wanted that stuff because you loved the story and you loved the world that you were immersed in, that mythology and that mythological world. Now, even though this had a corrupting influence on later films, we started to see things like George Lucas clearly appearing in his prequels to create characters that look suspiciously like they were there for toy marketing purposes. But, you know, even though you could point to stuff like that, the story itself hadn't become a product because George Lucas created this world, this mythology, this story. He loved it. It was like his own child. It was his artistic creation, and he genuinely did love it as such. But the moment it was purchased for money by Disney was the moment it became a product. So what you've got now is the actual story itself has become a product. Now, get woke, go broke, that has a certain truth to it, but at the end of the day, capitalism doesn't really care too much about any of that. Capitalism's sole driver at its heart is profit making, and profit is about ever-increasing sales. Capitalism and consumerism are about more. And as with most things in life, more actually equals less of the goodness, truth, and beauty that you really need in something to find your flourishing and to see that thing flourish. And so you are bombarded with a world where Star Wars has become this corporatized product, and it is over-marketed because the capitalist mentality wants to sell more stuff. So we've got to make more stuff to sell to you. And in a consumeristic entertainment environment where we now sit down and binge watch and consume ourselves to the point of, metaphorical obesity on television and streaming and everything else, they've got to have more and more product. But the more you have of a good thing, unless that good thing is God, because God is the ultimate source of all good and is inexhaustible, his goodness is inexhaustible, then the more you have of other good things, generally what happens is that actually, it creates a problem. You end up with less and less of the goodness, truth, and beauty. And that's exactly what you've got here. And basically, what has happened now is that consumerism has corrupted the mythology of Star Wars, because basically Star Wars, as I said, the mythology is now the commodity. It's a product. It's not that they've got products associated with it, but the mythology itself has become a commodity. And the other thing that consumerism has done is it has also corrupted film criticism as well, because film critics are not really that honest. So I told you earlier about the audience rating of Star Wars, The Acolyte, the TV series, and it's 14% on Rotten Tomatoes. But do you know what the critic rating is? The critics have given it an 83% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. There is absolutely no way that this film, even if you are on board with the ideology and the propaganda that has been shoehorned into the show, there's no way that the quality of the writing and the artistic endeavour absolutely in any way would represent 83%. It just doesn't, not even close. So why do critics put it that high? Well, because consumerism and because the consumeristic corporatized nature of mythology and storytelling like Star Wars means that if you aren't actually doing things as a critic that will help the corporation sell more of its Star Wars product, then you are a hindrance to them. They don't care about your views. They are only interested in you saying things that will help them to market their product. And so what you consistently hear about in the world of professional film criticism is that critics are actually excluded from the exclusive events and the early premieres and things like that if they are not actually towing the line. And so you get a lot of critics who are just too scared to actually push back against the studio system, this massive gigantic corporation that is Disney, because of the consumeristic, capitalistic nature of how all of that has corrupted the mythology and how much control that exerts. And so they just don't. They take, at best, you will see them taking sort of moderate lines. If they know something is absolutely dysfunctional, artistically speaking, they still won't be fully honest about it. They'll say, oh, it could have been better, or it's not quite that bad, or oh, it's really great. The colours in the background are lovely. But what they don't do is they just don't speak honestly. And so you end up with these absurd disparities between the critic class and the ordinary everyday watchers of a mythology like Star Wars. So to wrap this up, the eternal question, I guess, is can Star Wars be saved? And the answer, of course, is yes, of course it can be. But is it likely to be? I'm skeptical. Because what would be required is two major shifts. Number one is there needs to be an asceticism of sorts that comes back to Star Wars. So what that means is Star Wars needs to go cold turkey, and there needs to be a fast, a break from regular production of Star Wars content and TV series and movies, there needs to actually be probably a solid 10 years fasting from Star Wars. No new Star Wars, because that's the only way that you break the shackles of consumerism and the addiction to consuming more and more newer and newer products. And the only way to do that is to actually withdraw this mythology from the world of consumerism, so it's no longer a product, and you need to break that shackle. You need to go cold turkey, like a drug addict who's been mainlining some destructive drug for far too long. What you actually need to do is you need to break that shackle. So that's the first thing. Second thing is there is a cultural conversion required. It will absolutely be needed to allow for a revival of goodness, truth, and beauty in our art and mythology. The reason our mythology, our little stories, are so corrupted is because our big story is corrupt. We have lost touch with the fundamental truth of who we are, what the world is, what reality is, and so our stories, generally speaking, and the exceptions prove the rule, don't reflect that anymore. And so to fix that, there is a cultural conversion required away from this nihilistic, hedonistic, self-gratifying, materialistic view of the world and return to a more authentic human anthropology, which Christianity gave to the world. And of course, there's also going to need to be a systemic culture that is weeded out of the studio system. It will absolutely need to be addressed, because clearly there are people now embedded in the studio system who are absolutely committed to these particular ideological outcomes. And so you will need to address that. You need to have people who are writing and who are directing and who are creating the artistic content for this mythological world to actually have a more grounded vision of reality, something that is very much grounded in that tradition of goodness, truth, and beauty, and what it is to tell authentic stories, and a recognition of what reality really is, not ideologues. Because what do ideologues do? They try and take their ideas and impose them upon reality, instead of starting with what is real, which makes something universal and makes a mythology great. That's why Tolkien's mythology is so great. It is grounded in what is good, true, and beautiful, and it starts with what is real and then goes out into the world of fantasy. It doesn't start with an ideological fantasy and say, let's impose this upon reality, like what is happening right now in the world of Star Wars. So there you go. That's my thoughts. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth, and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you tomorrow on The Dispatches.